I would be willing to bet a large amount of information that OpenAI is completely penetrated by multiple intelligence agencies. There's a lot of surface area, and when companies don't even have it in their mind that there might be other interests at stake in this person's employment, it just opens up a, world of opportunity.
Hello, data nerds. My guest is Josh Steinman. Josh is the co-founder and CEO of Galvanick, a cybersecurity company building tools to secure industrial infrastructure and AI systems. Previously, he served as the deputy assistant to the president and senior director of cyber policy at the National Security Council under the first Trump administration. Josh, welcome to World of DaaS.
Auren, great to be here.
I'm super excited. Now, I'd love to dive in on Spies. I assume every big tech company unwittingly employs tons of foreign spies. What do you think is the rate of infiltration? And it's every good intelligence agency around the world in every company, every major tech company.
The benchmark that I have for this is the Twitter. It was a report to the Twitter board that was put together by their chief security officer, who I believe at the time was a guy named Mudge Zatko, during Elon's purchase, pre-X. And what he essentially admits in that report is that they found instances of numerous nation states that literally had just straight up assets inside the company. And they didn't even.
They had some publicly ones that have been charged. They're working for things like Saudi Arabia, from many different types of countries.
Saudi, India, I think the Israelis, a few others, and just yesterday, someone was talking about how one of the Israeli firms that was being used by Twitter to verify identities was then turning around and working with a doxing network in Europe to go after people. So the whole point here is just, there's a lot of surface area, and when companies don't even have it in their mind that there might be other interests at stake in this person's employment, it just opens up a, world of opportunity.
And the person could be a full-on spy, or I know in some of the cases in the Twitter, it was they were being either bribed by agencies or, maybe their family was threatened or something like that to give them information or, et cetera.
Yeah. One of the most interesting aspects of having lived in that world for a long time is that you realize just how dangerous mirror imaging can be. Mirror imaging is this concept where we sort of project onto other parties. So if you think about you think, oh, the intelligence community, you're an American, and you're like, oh, that person's the NSA or the CIA or this or that. The United States is a country of over 340 million people. 380 if you count the people that are here illegally. But they don't count, so we'll go with 330. And essentially the control schemas that we have are very different than almost any other country. And so I often like to remind myself that, these things are done for a reason, right? Espionage is conducted for a reason. And it's not even the reason that those organizations inside the United States conduct espionage, right?
It could be to win a contract or something or whatever. There could be a lot of
to achieve national objectives. You look at certain countries and, there's 35, 40, maybe 50 serious clans or families that run that country. And so when you ask what's their national interest, it's going to be the national interest of those families. So when it's what's the purpose of an intelligence community in that country? You have to remember that it may not look like what we expect it to look like. It may not look like some intelligence officer going to someone and being like, hey, I need you to take this thumb drive and put it into a computer one, and then don't ask any questions and never tell anyone again. Sure, it'll look like that, but there are going to be other cases where they're like, if you see examples of people insulting this, that, or the other, you should really use your position to try and prevent that or make policy against that so that it doesn't happen because it offends our sensibilities. If you were to go onto Google right now and start searching around for stuff related to Tiananmen Square, you have to ask yourself, have the search results around those terms been altered or in some way affected by folks, algorithmically who, may have an opinion on those types of topics? And the answer is what we see in the Twitter files was absolutely. And so I extrapolate that out to essentially every big tech company because the targets are just too juicy.
And it could just be like cause chaos on Slack, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Complain about things. Let's bring random grievances up and stuff like that. And
I mean, that's the classic,
yeah.
I'm more talking about like, you run operations to achieve national objectives. So the point that I'm making is like, there may be people in these companies, I guarantee you there are people in these companies that are there that are achieving national objectives that it doesn't match up to what an American would say it's an intelligence operation. It's like ish.
So essentially what they're doing is they're often guiding a very large company, whether it be a Google or a Facebook or whatever it might be, Microsoft. They're guiding a very large company to help achieve the ends of their country or their clan. And obviously this is usually not in the company's best interest to do that. So how do companies guard against this? Like what can they do to reduce that? Obviously you can't go all the way to zero, but just like if you had somebody hacking, you'd want to reduce that. What
Yeah.
can you do to reduce it?
I mean, it's really hard. I think you just have to be very mindful of who you're hiring and where you're putting them in your company. And, part of it is that you just have to be realistic about who your personnel are.
But you can make an assumption that like every intelligence agency in the world that's decent has like assets in OpenAI, and you should just make that. We have to make that assumption, right? Like, why would they not? Like, it's just so obvious.
I would be willing to bet a large amount of information that OpenAI is completely penetrated by multiple intelligence agencies.
They have to be.
And has been for a while.
Why would you not do that if you're a smart intelligence agency?
No, I
right?
guess the point that I'm making is like, what can you do? And it's like, well, you need to be realistic about who your employees are.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please sign up for our newsletter. Go to worldofdaas.com. The link is in the description below. Now back to the video.
And then you have employees that may not have the same interests reviewing each other's work.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. When we think about like industrial companies could have lots of problems. There could be kinetic things that happen with industrial companies. If you think of like power plants or factories or other types of things. And I imagine a lot of these companies just are not that hardened. Like hackers can attack these companies, right?
Yeah, interesting Wall Street Journal article dropped last week where sources, probably from the Biden administration, were relaying to the reporter that in December they had high-level talks with the Chinese, and the Chinese essentially admitted openly, straight to the Biden reps, that they had pre-positioned malicious cyber tools on American critical infrastructure and had been for some time. Now, it's one thing for like our intelligence community to say that to Congress, even in the open, even in an unclassified forum. It's quite another to have the adversary themselves sit down with you, as reported in this Wall Street Journal article, and say, oh yeah, we're pre-positioned on your critical infrastructure.
And it's used as a kind of like a bargaining chip or a threat or something. I mean, obviously we already knew that. It's not like we didn't know that.
It's like one thing to know something about someone else. It's another thing to know that they know that you know it. And so the act of like really declaring something very openly is almost like it's unnatural, right? It's not normally
especially
done.
in the world of foreign policy, intelligence services.
Yeah. So for a senior Chinese official to be like, oh yeah, we're pre-positioned on your infrastructure. Like if you guys come to the aid of the Taiwanese, like we're going to take it down. I've been making this joke even in public for many years, which is like, how do you know when the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan? Like, what's the first thing that's going to happen?
I assume all of our power is going to go out and our
exactly. The joke is traffic lights on Oahu stop working. So so that's a joke, right? But it's definitely another thing for like a senior Ministry of State security official or a senior, People's Liberation Army officer to just sit there and be like, oh yeah, like we've got that. Like, and we know that you know that, but now we're telling you that we know that you know that, and we know that you know that we know that. So we can all speak frankly here about what we expect you to do or not do.
It's hard to get better at defending it. It's like when you're a financial institution like a bank, like you're getting attacked all the time, and they're actually trying to execute the attack by stealing money. That is usually the goal of the attack on a bank. And so therefore you have a lot of experience with, defending and understanding, and often when you have been successfully hacked because you see money go, and there's all these things, right? Whereas with a power plant or factory, you don't have that feedback loop to know, because
Yeah.
they're only going to take it down in an extreme circumstance, right? And so I imagine it's just much, much, much harder. I assume, first of all, I assume that the targets are softer to begin
Yeah.
with, and then it's much
Yeah.
harder to defend than a bank, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, one of the reasons that they're such challenging environments is because they sort of get built once, 10, 20, 30 years ago, and then operated in perpetuity. These aren't products, these aren't things that get renewed regularly. It just creates a lot of opportunity. There also really isn't an incentive to protect them. Unfortunately, that's like one of the most depressing things to realize. There's really no incentive to protect the factories that make the stuff that we use to defend the country. And if you look at like rail and water, two very prominent examples of very basic cybersecurity guidance coming out from the regulatory agencies that oversee those industries, and the industries themselves just like hitting the ceiling, objecting, going to the hill. So it's really hard. It's like this sort of principal agent problem, because the minute that something happens, everyone's going to instinctively just say, oh, the government's going to take care of it. When in reality, the thing that should have been happening all along is these companies should have been, paying more attention. And not to say that it's like easy for them, right? The way that I would sort of scope this whole thing is that we have been enjoying the benefits of digitization for probably 40 years now, longer likely. And what we should have been doing is pricing in the risk as we enjoyed those benefits, and we haven't been. We've basically just been free riding off them.
What did our adversaries learn from the Stuxnet hack? Because here, and there, we essentially were able to go into some older Siemens turbines, able to get those turbines to maybe rotate faster than they should have been rotating. I imagine like a lot of our adversaries went through the code, understood that code, maybe even use that now against our own stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so those are centrifuges being
Yeah,
used to
centrifuges. Yep.
enrich uranium for the Iranian nuclear. I'm just explaining this for folks at home, for the Iranian nuclear program. And the allegation is that code was deployed through various and creative and diverse means to essentially overwrite some of the instructions, like give them new instructions on how fast to spin, and that caused a cascading reaction that destroyed a bunch of those machines, which were very sensitive and had likely been smuggled into Iran to do that. So, yeah, I think the big lesson there was just that the physical world is just as vulnerable to cyber attacks as the digital world. Now, that was a very exquisite operation, whoever ran it. And so I think that, in the intervening nearly 20 years, think about that, 20 years.
That was 20 years ago.
Yeah, what, like, I don't
Wow.
know.
I
Pull
like,
up
you're right. You're right. I mean,
pull up the
you're right.
date. It was
That's probably
like
when they started it.
late
Yeah. Oh my
late
gosh, that's
2000. I mean,
crazy.
I think the
I'm
public
feeling a little old.
acknowledgement, here, we'll just pull it up.
No. I think, yeah, 2010 was the public
Sure.
acknowledgement. So you're right. So it probably was 20 years ago.
They
Yeah.
say development. Wikipedia says development since 2005. Public acknowledgement in or uncovered in 2010. So even
Yeah.
then, okay, 15
Yeah.
years, but you got to
Yeah.
imagine
Yeah.
happened
20
before then.
years. It's crazy.
So 20 years, right? 20 years, you have this very prominent example of, because think about it this way, and this is, how we used to talk on NSC in very unclassified generalities. Here's an even better example. How else would you have accomplished that mission? There's a great operation, probably one of the greatest special operations missions in Second World War history. The Nazis were pursuing a different strategy to achieve a nuclear weapon, right? They were using heavy water, H3O, to create nuclear reactions that they could weaponize. The Nazi program was relying on deuterium, which they were using to catalyze the nuclear reaction for the bomb. So in order to produce it, it's incredibly energy intensive, and they had to have lots of power. And one of the places where they were doing this was in Norway, where they have enormous hydropower stations. The British Special Operations Executive put together a group of Norwegian partisans, trained them in a whole bunch of skills, parachuted them into the Norwegian hinterlands, and had a bunch of teams converge on one of these facilities in order to destroy it enough to ruin the heavy water manufacturing process that the Germans were running. It took almost a year. I think the op took over a year to plan and a month plus to execute. So 1 year, call it tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and fast forward 70 years later, and it's a line of code. So you have to imagine that like what's going on is we're creating optionality for our war making apparatus to accomplish things that would have taken an industrial infrastructure, a delivery mechanism, trained staff, active platforms. And we're just completely creating a new paradigm that enables them to be delivered electronically.
Now, is part of like really the goal of surviving? Like, if you're if you're in the government, if you went back into the government, there's some ways like we have to harden these targets more so they're harder to hack. But in some ways, like maybe that's impossible. Like, is it just like is the bigger strategy just like resilience? Like, okay, you take down 6 power plants, but like whatever, we can get the other ones running, and then we can make these come back up over time, or we can bring things up. Like, is that the key thing in the end?
If you were to ask me for my sort of like magic, and I don't have any magic, but my magic solution, it would be a mix of capability to run manually for critical
Yep.
infrastructure
Yep.
and separate from the digital systems that enable you to have digital control. Second, and not to plug the company, but like what we're doing at Galvanick, which is continuous monitoring for industrial systems and networks. So it's like you can operate digitally, but you have to watch everything, every single source of data within the
Yeah.
4 walls of that facility, watch it very carefully. You have to have baselines, be able to understand what patterns look like, understand what malicious activity looks like digitally. Then you need the ability to essentially cut off the digital systems. And then you need the ability to operate manually. And then I think you do need redundancy and resilience and the ability to reconstitute. And if you were to sort of put those things together and pursue them in concert, I think you'd have a pretty good plan that
Now, if you think of like the Russian-Ukrainian war that's been going on for the last 3 years, I would have thought if you had told me that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, that they would have been extremely successful in taking down, and the factories and the power and all this other stuff, because obviously they're great hackers. And then I was talking to somebody recently, and he said, well, the reason they weren't as successful is because they had been hacking them for so long that it was this cat and mouse game. Like, and then they actually helped build that resiliency over the 10 years prior to that. And we obviously we don't have that here in the US, where we've kind of seen that kind of level of actually trying to shut some of these things down. Do you think that argument holds?
Yeah, not only does it hold, but it was definitely how we were sort of thinking about things from 2021. Yeah, I mean, the Russians had gone after the Ukrainian critical infrastructure, commercial infrastructure in various ways for a decade plus. The NotPetya cyber attack in 2017, which caused tens of billions of dollars of damage worldwide, was essentially the Russian military targeting the Ukrainian economy through the Ukrainian version of QuickBooks, which then the spreading mechanism that they used enabled it to just spread worldwide, affecting, the British hospital system, ports in the United States, chocolate factories, drug factories, a whole bunch of other things that were not the intended targets. The Black Energy incident, where the Russians went after the Ukrainian power grid, supposedly, same thing. And
So
in
you're
those
just
cases,
like, essentially they're getting better about, okay, we got to go offline. We have to go to the manuals. We have to,
yeah,
we have
and
to, like that type of thing. Like, you're just
the
like,
Ukrainian power grid, notoriously during that incident, as it has been reported publicly, was manual enough that they were able to essentially roll back away from the digital systems. And my guess, I don't have any insight here, but my guess is that they took that to heart over the intervening period from that incident forward. Whereas like you go to a publicly traded board of like a big energy company today, and you're like, hey, we want you to have like the ability to operate manually, and we want you to exercise that twice a year. And they're going to be like, son, I've got quarterly earnings to meet. Like,
Totally.
you want me to spend 500 man hours a quarter on what? I've got fancy software that I bought from, SAP 12 years
Yeah.
ago that
Yeah.
does this. Like, you go sit in the corner, I'll call you if I need you.
Now, what are some of your learnings on things like backdoors on Chinese chips and some of these? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah. I think you have to assume that anything that comes out of China, there's a capacity for it to be compromised by the Chinese Communist Party, by the Chinese intelligence apparatus. Do I think that means that everything is compromised? No. But the point is, like, you plan so that you can understand the range of possible scenarios that you might encounter. And so you just have to build that in as a planning assumption. And I think anyone that doesn't do that is doing themselves and their constituents a disservice.
How do you think about things like DeepSeek?
Yeah.
In some ways, supposedly China was able, or the people behind DeepSeek were able to accomplish a fairly impressive model on lower cost with,
Yeah.
maybe not the most advanced chips, et cetera. How does that, do you think, affect our policy of what we should export, what we shouldn't export, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch to unpack there. Obviously, Jensen showed up in Beijing yesterday. NVIDIA's a great company, and I hope they do well. They're doing well. I think I even own some shares. Great. At the same time, I've heard like 20 to 30% of high end NVIDIA chips end up making their way to China,
Right.
and
It's
there is
impossible. I mean, it's impossible to, if you're going to send them to Singapore or wherever, this is like, you just put it on a plane. It's not like they're heavy.
I'm on a boat.
Yeah.
And by the
Send them
way,
anywhere.
like, there's no way. I'm sorry.
In a suitcase when you're
There's
flying.
no way that the leadership of that company doesn't know that. There's no way. The money's too good. And so, there's a bunch of things going on here. Like, one, there's a trade conversation happening between the president and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, who leads China at the current moment. Then there's a conversation about trade. There's conversations about Taiwan. There's all these things happening. Then there's a conversation about reshoring. So, I urge all these folks, all these chattering heads, although they get paid not to, but you sort of have to give the president like the latitude that he needs, because I think he's probably one of the smartest people alive today. Having worked for him for 4 years and like gone in with that assumption, it was just validated time and time again when I worked for him. So I think there's a lot going on. I'm open to a bunch of options. I think that he's got amazing judgment. So we'll see what happens there. But for the Nvidia crowd, like, they just have to understand that like the jig is up, Everybody knows that they're skirting the sanctions. So the question is like, what are they going to do in exchange, right? Like, everybody knows now. And they've known for a while. Again, it's like the same thing with the CCP officer sitting across from the Biden people in December being like, hey, just so you know, like, we're totally on your infrastructure. It's like the
Yeah.
mask off moment where now everyone has to publicly acknowledge that we all know what's going on. Like, we all know what's going on. Like, NVIDIA's second biggest market is China. They know it, we know it, and we know that they know it, and we know that they know that we know it. Okay, like, let's have that conversation now. And so I think that'll be very interesting. We'll see how it plays out, and I wouldn't want to get in front of the president in terms of how to handle that.
Now, when you were in government, you wrote like the white paper that eventually turned into the Defense Innovation Unit, the DIU. DIU seems like it's worked out like super well, and we'll cut through a lot of bureaucracy, et cetera. Like, what did we do? And obviously, there are like books about it and stuff. But what do we like? Why did it work when so many other things to reform and do other things like didn't work over the years?
Yeah. So, I wouldn't want to claim exclusive credit. There were other teams that were working on it in the Pentagon. The way in which I had advocated for that was directly to the Chief of Naval Operations and the Director of the National Security Agency, for whom I wrote a white paper, because I was going out to Silicon Valley on behalf of the Chief of Naval Operations. It's all over now. Everybody's moved on. I'm just going to say it. So I was working directly for CNO. I was a military officer. This was back in 2013. And Ben Coleman, who's been nominated to be an assistant secretary of the Navy, Manpower and Reserve Affairs, fighter pilot at the time, wrote this article, said the military needs more disruptive thinkers. It became the #1 blog post ever read on, I think, War on the Rocks at the time, and shared all over the Pentagon, shared all over the services. And the chief of naval operations, senior officer in the Navy, called Ben to the Pentagon, to his office in the E-Ring, and was basically like, all right, son, I'm tagging you in. Go find me some heretics. So Ben was tasked to work with a 3-star and went out and found 10, people that just kind of didn't fit in the Navy. I was one of them. CNO brought us in and was like, look, go find asymmetric opportunities for the United States Navy, and you have my support, and we'll get you money. So one of the projects that I was working on in 2013 was bringing augmented reality to the fleet. So I flew out to Google, talked my way into Google X, and convinced them to allow me, on behalf of the United States Navy, to join the Google Glass Explorers program. They were like, look, it's very sensitive, the Department of Defense, so don't tell anyone. I don't think we ever signed an NDA, and so we'll talk about it now. I had a team of programmers working with me and this other program manager, a civilian, and we started building apps for Google Glass that you could put on a Navy ship to just speed up what you would call like the John Boyd OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. In the course of doing that, I was talking to all these folks at Google who were like pulling me aside after the meetings and being like, hey, look, there's this huge movement to stop taking meetings with the Department of Defense because everyone and their mother comes out here and they take meetings all over the company and they never ask for anything. Nobody understands what's going on, and it's a waste of our time. And it goes all the way up to the executives, and they're thinking about cutting it off. As a military officer, I was like, I understand what's happening here. By 2013, everyone knew that like tech was going to be important in warfare. And whenever a new commanding officer takes command of a unit, they'll go out and they'll talk to all the places. They'll go get a capabilities brief from all the other units that interact with them. And they just want to know what's going on. With those types of capability briefing meetings, you never have an ask. You just want to know what they do and who to talk to in case you need it. So I synthesized all this information. I took it back to CNO and I was like, look, we need to create an embassy style function that can be the entity that owns relationships in Silicon Valley. And then when you have unit commanders or, other senior officials come out, they go see that embassy, and the embassy makes sure that they're maintaining those relationships. And when they need to, they'll bring those visitors into these critical meetings, but they'll manage those relationships as a way to continue building them.
Now, a lot of people, especially in tech, are kind of extremely negative on defense primes. Like, where do you stand on it? How do you think about it?
Yeah, that was one of the things that when we were at this task force I was telling you about, it's called the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell. You've got a good acronym when it's got nested acronyms. So we called it the CRIC, CNO's Rapid Innovation Cell. Nested acronyms, it's like super high level in the Department of Defense. Like one of the biggest conclusions we came to in 2013 was that we needed new primes, plural, to be able to natively go after these emerging warfare capabilities.
Think of these primes, like it seems like almost everyone is universally like somewhat negative on it, or at least, or from somewhat negative to extremely negative.
Our thinking was that essentially the current primes just had not been born in the age of technology and capability that we were now seeing. And you needed new entrants, new primes to be able to integrate those new technologies. I mean, look, you look at an F-18 and look at an aircraft carrier, and the United States of America's ability to take 4,500 souls, man, train, equip a floating city, put it anywhere in the world, refuel it at will, and launch a fleet of aircraft and recover a fleet of aircraft off it, essentially in perpetuity, is probably one of humanity's greatest achievements. Like probably top 100, I'd say, in terms of industrial capacity. And that's due to the defense primes that we have today. Now,
we were doing that well 40 years ago too.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, but the point is, like, you have to, game respects game. So
yeah.
There is utility in these companies. There is necessity in these companies. At the same time, like they're not native to, and they are definitely connected, very well connected to the cadres inside the Pentagon that essentially want to operate business as usual. And so, when you think about what next generation conflicts may look like, those primes have had a harder time adopting these new modalities that I think have the possibility to leapfrog American capabilities in certain ways. And so, we talked about building new primes really from the beginning, right from 2013. And obviously now we're seeing the emergence of companies like Anduril, companies like True Anomaly, and more that are, capable of operating at that very senior level. And I think it's important. I think that it's a good thing because you need to essentially have like new blood that's coming in that just thinks about things very differently and isn't like, all right, we have to go out and get the next fighter contract, but like, hey, I want to go out and deliver new capabilities that enable us to deliver kinetic payloads, right? Which is the thing that the fighters do. But when you've built a capability and a pipeline of people to make fighters, like that becomes your focus, not the outcome.
Also depends on like what are you nimble enough to recruit the best talent, because the best talent, they can't have too much bureaucracy if they're going to create something. And so in the 1962, Lockheed was getting this incredible talent who could make the Blackbird, and they can make these other types of things. Like these were incredibly talented engineers who they able to recruit. My guess today is that it's just much, much harder for them to recruit these like incredibly talented engineers, because you have to, like, a lot of them, like when I talk to people there, they have to like keep time. They have to like time card themselves, and there's
Yeah.
just all this bureaucracy. It just, they've become much bigger entities. And whereas like in Anduril, you're just going to be able to recruit much more talented people. You give them stock options. It's more of a startup, etc.
Look, I'm sure that's true. I am guessing though that places like Phantom Works and Skunk Works probably still have a easy time recruiting top talent to build crazy things that we'll find out about 15 years after they start, 20 years after they start. I mean, just look at the X-47, which, the announcement said we had been flying it for some time now. I'll let the audience ask and maybe answer for themselves what that means. But like, we can still do like insane things. And that's done with the help of the primes. So I'm not one of these guys that's out here like, oh, down with Northrop, down with Boeing, all these other places. It's like, look, those companies have a place and have a heritage and a capability to do things that are really extraordinary. But the whole point here is like you want new entrants that can also sort of challenge the strategic direction and the capability, and I think it keeps everybody honest.
All right, a couple of personal questions that we ask all of our guests. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
I don't know. I'm super paranoid about food and what's been going on to the American food supply. So I tweet a lot about seed oils, industrial lubricants being used as food, crazy ingredients. Basically, in the past 3 years, I've tried to cut out nearly anything that's not, uh, natural.
It's hard to do,
From
right?
It's
I mean,
super
it's
hard.
really, really
Yeah,
hard to do. It's like all of a sudden you should realize, like, I can't eat anything. Like, it's like
it's
I'm eating
wild.
some, like, it becomes, or I have to pay like 4x for my food or something.
I'm like packing meals on airplane. Like I'm bringing like hard boiled eggs on an airplane, and they're like, "Do you want the little Biscoff cookies?" And you look over, and it's like 28 ingredients, and you're like, "I can't have this. Like, no, thank you."
The problem is those Biscoff cookies taste
They're
so
good.
freaking good. I
Yeah,
love them. That's
I
like my
know.
guilty pleasure is those cookies.
Yeah,
And like United doesn't have them anymore. They still have them on American, but United doesn't
yeah,
have them. And sometimes I'm like, I should just fly America just for that cookie.
yeah. So yeah, that's probably something that I'm just really like not actively angry, but I'm just like disappointed in is that you
Yeah.
have these. This is one of the reasons
But
why I
is
was
it a
so excited.
conspiracy, or is it just like one thing leads to another or something?
I think it's a structural, there are things that I think aren't like 10 people in a room getting together and talking about. And they're sort of like implicit structural conspiracies, right? It's like everybody kind of, it's a shelling point, right? This concept where people are just like, well, the corn lobby is really going to support these subsidies. And, this weird oil that they produce as a byproduct can be used by us. And so we can go in and we know that they'll support us in the committee when we try and get the ag subsidies for this or that or whatever. And so I have a feeling that it's sort of like a conspiracy by default,
Yeah.
where it's like there wasn't like one person who was like, oh, I know what we're going to do. We're going to poison the American people by, feeding them industrial lubricants. It was just like over time, consultants came in and they were like, man, you've got this byproduct. Like, what are we going to do with it? Like, we got to find a way to monetize it.
Yeah.
And then they're like, yeah, but like engine lubricants are better if you just make them out of complex carbon chains as opposed to this or that. So let's see what else we could do. And then they're like, eventually someone was just like, oh yeah, you can
We'll
feed it
eat
to
it.
animals.
Totally. All right. Last question we ask all of our guests. What conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
I think this whole like follow your passion thing, a lot of people say this as a critique. So I'll just sort of pile onto this. I'm very skeptical of it because I think that when you're good at something, it compounds into joy. And so instead of like you're doing it the wrong way, right? You're like, oh, what do I enjoy? I enjoy drawing or something like that. So I'm going to go do drawing. And it's like, I'm just not sure that that's like a productive. Whereas like if you find a way to be excellent at something and you pursue that excellence, like you derive joy out of the excellence. And so I just think that thinking more seriously about how to professionally spend your time and using as your North Star that, like, what can I find that I can be really good at? I think it creates a virtuous cycle around joy and fulfillment, as opposed to starting with the sort of neurochemical, like, what can I do that will have a feedback loop, right? That will, immediately bring me that dopamine hit. To me, it's much more like find something to be very good at, learn what it means to be good at something, learn what it means to develop excellence, and then use that pattern that you've built to find other things to be excellent at. So yeah, I think that's like
And
what I would.
like if you like when you're giving advice, because I'm sure a lot of people come to you for career advice, etc. You can always be like you could be working on your weaknesses and getting better at those, and or you could be working on your strengths and getting better at those. Like, how should one divide their time? How should one be thinking about that?
I try and just exclusively focus on working on my strengths, and then you want to identify your weaknesses. And then if there's a way that you can like 80/20, like fix or mitigate those, I say do it. I'm not sure that this is good advice, by the way. It's just like how I operate. It's like there are things that I'm excellent at. I want to go do those things. And then there are things that I'm not great at. And it's like, I'd much rather find a way to bring someone else in to do those things than to try and build up that capacity myself. Because I know what it took for me to be excellent at whatever it is. It was like years, sometimes decades of work. And so when there's something that I'm not good at, I know what it's going to take for me to be good at that. And it's just like, I need to find some way to,
Sometimes the weakness, you don't go from like terrible to very good. You go from like terrible to mediocre or something. My rubric is like, how debilitating is that weakness? So if you're just like a crazy heroin addict right now, it probably does make sense to go work on that weakness, right? It's just completely taking over your life. But if it's like, I don't know, you're late to meetings or something, like, okay, maybe that's not like an important weakness to work on or something, like there are other things to do it.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah. This has been awesome. This has been great. Thank you, Josh Steinman, for joining us at World of DaaS. I follow you, by the way, at Joshua Steinman on X. I love your tweets or posts or whatever they're called now. I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun. If you're a super data nerd, go to worldofdaas.com. That's DAAS, worldofdaas.com, and sign up for our weekly Data as a Service news roundup newsletter. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, consider rating this podcast and leaving a review. For more World of DaaS, and DaaS is DAAS, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. And also check out YouTube for videos. You can find me at Twitter at Auren, that's AUREN, Auren, and we'd love to hear from you.